Hello to you all. I'm Dr. Matthew Rankin, and welcome to this coffee talk. And first and foremost, I want to just thank everybody over at Black Family Homeschool Educator and Scholars, the organization I'll refer to going forward as BFHES. And just thank you all for inviting me to give this coffee talk. I'm very excited to get into this topic. The title of this coffee talk is Subtly but Surely, the Gendering of Black Homeschooling Motivations. And I want to, before we delve into the actual topic, the sort of nuts and bolts of the nitty gritty of it, I want to give a little bit of a backstory as to how I arrived at this topic. So this dates back years. We're talking about the spring of 2016. And back then, I had not formally enrolled as a graduate student yet at Emory University. I'm basically on a vacation with my family, and we're on a road trip. And we're listening to a public radio segment about homeschooling in America, more specifically, the rise of Black homeschooling in America. And prior to that segment on the radio, I never really had given homeschool that much thought. I knew that, or homeschooling that much thought. I knew that it existed. I knew that it was a thing, but it was such a rarity that I just really didn't give it too close of a listen or a study prior to. And the story was really captivating because it talked about how so many Black families and Black parents were basically throwing up their hands and, for lack of a better term, giving up on the traditional education apparatus and pulling their children from that system to educate them themselves. And we'll talk about this more so as we get into the talk about the research says, but long story short, many of the parents felt as though their children, and more specifically their Black boys, were not being treated well by teachers and administrators in the traditional education system. And when I say traditional education, I'm talking more so about public, private, or parochial schools. And that topic, it captivated me the whole entire way through. It was a short segment. And I didn't know that I would actually revisit that topic years later for my dissertation. I just knew that the story was interesting. I tucked it away and just kept it with me. And I'm glad that I did, because years later, actually 4 years later, when COVID hits, this is circa March 2020, I revisited the topic and decided to actually go into it full steam ahead. And I'm so glad that I did, because that decision to delve into this topic opened up my eyes and opened up my world in ways that I could never have imagined. So that's just pretty much the background of how I got into the topic of homeschooling and Black homeschooling. And I also want to talk about the fact that by virtue of that decision and me going into this topic, we became homeschooling parents ourselves, along with millions of others, right? During COVID, our child who was enrolled in prep school, we actually brought him home during that time, and we never let him back. We brought him home and we never let him go, and we never let him go back. And we're just so thankful for that decision. And, now at the time, he was a young one, now he's 11. And our daughter, who is 6 now, she actually has never been in a formal traditional school setting. She's only been under the umbrella of homeschooling. And so it just goes to show you how sometimes following your passions or following your interests can lead to so many different frontiers and so many different realities. But that's enough of me. What I want to do is provide a little bit of an overview as to what this talk is going to be about, this coffee talk. And basically, long story short, again, I gave you my little bit of a background. My name is Dr. Matthew Rankin, a graduate of Emory University's Department of Sociology. And my topic, or my dissertation, focuses on Black homeschooling, notably the 3 pillars of homeschooling. From my vantage point, we're talking about motivations, parental motivations, curriculum, and we're talking about instruction. Those are the 3 pillars those are the 3 pillars that uphold my dissertation and my study. For this topic, though, for this coffee talk, we're going to talk about how gender imbues and shapes and informs parents' decisions about homeschooling their sons and daughters. And I want to be very clear from the outset of this conversation that when I talk about gender, I am talking about it more so in the traditional binary sense, male-female, father-mother, or husband-wife, and son and daughter. And so I just want to be very clear about that from the get-go, so we can frame our conversation in a very clear way. And so first things first, talking about what the literature says, and very much based upon, it was very much in line with what that segment said during that public radio segment, that public radio segment, where it talks about how many parents, many Black mothers and fathers have grown disenchanted with the traditional or public or parochial or private school apparatus, and they don't feel as though it's serving their children very well. This is well documented not only in the academic literature, but also you see it in news stories, or you might see a news segment, even as recently as over the past few years, about just the rise of Black homeschooling, and especially when COVID hit, my Lord, that's when it really took off in terms of just the numbers being in the forefront of the national conversation about education. And it talks about, how there's clearly a racial component to that, right? There's a racial protectionism that a lot of mothers and fathers are enacting for their children, especially for their boys. Black boys tend to fare pretty poorly in the education system with regard to success, or in terms of when it comes to treatment and punishment in that regard, as opposed to their white peers who may be in similar class backgrounds or may have similar disciplinary infractions. But Black boys and increasingly Black girls are being treated and have been treated more harshly than their non-Black peers. And so, or whether it's in that sort of regard with punishment, or when it comes to opportunities to advance their studies or extracurriculars, or when it comes to social relationships, or when it comes to just relationships with their teachers and their administrators, there just seems to be there's a friction there, or there's a sense of discomfort, or a sense of a lack of continuity, or a lack of alignment. And so parents, they get fed up, they're frustrated, even after trying so hard to work with administrators and teachers and trying to work with their kids. It's just not working. And so many parents, by virtue of that need to protect their children, especially their Black boys, to protect them from the system, the school to prison pipeline, they'll pull them from that system. And so while the racial component is very, very clear and present, I was always curious. I was like, hey, I wonder if gender can shape or play a role in that decision or that motivation to pull your child from the traditional schooling apparatus into your home to teach. And what the literature shows is that while the racial component for homeschooling is very clear and apparent, when it comes to the gender component for homeschooling, it's not really present in the literature. What I found is that when it comes to gender and Black parenting strategies, that's where the actual linkage is present in the literature. It talks about gender and Black parenting, more so in terms of how parents go about practicing something called ethnic racial socialization, where they're actually, through their behaviors and teachings, teaching their sons and daughters, about Blackness and about Black identity, and also teaching them anti-racist strategies. Also, we go a little deeper where the gender component comes in. It's called gendered ethnic racial socialization, where we're talking about the ways in which mothers and fathers will actually teach racial socialization differently for their sons and daughters. For the daughters, oftentimes these lessons revolve around lessons in comportment and sort of intrinsic qualities, whereas for the boys, it's more so about ways to combat racism and ways to combat prejudice and bias. So it may seem subtle, but again, they're very meaningful. I wanted to know, okay, well, if these practices are taking place in terms of Black parenting strategies, how does that manifest in actual homeschooling strategies or homeschooling, lessons and things like that? And so I wanted to delve into that topic. And so to do this study, I went about, my dissertation is a mixed methods study involving both quantitative and qualitative methods. But for this topic, or this one individual segment of the dissertation, which focuses on the gendering of Black homeschooling motivations, I use or employ solely qualitative methods. I use one-on-one interviews or one-on-two interviews when I'm actually interviewing it's either myself and one parent, or myself and a married couple. And those were the interviews. And then after the interviews had concluded, I conducted focus groups with either all mother or all father panels. And that was a great way to basically come full circle and see if a lot of the ideas that had emerged in the one-on-one interviews and one-on-two interviews, to see if when I actually have the parents in a same gender setting or same gender interview setup, to see if those themes still ring true. And many ways they did. And what I found in my findings with these conversations with parents, with mothers and fathers, and with this study is that gender does play like I said, subtle but very meaningful and powerful role in shaping parents' motivations for homeschooling their kids. What I found is that parents, their motivations stem from two different but very much related places. So when it comes to homeschooling the Black boys, it comes from something I call the motivation or the idea to build from without. Or building from without. So when it comes to the gendering of Black parents' homeschooling motivations, when it comes to the homeschooling their boys or their sons, it comes from the impetus to build from without. And what I mean by that is it's the impetus to remove external barriers or negative influences that influence Black boys' educational experiences. So that comes from interpersonal biases and prejudices from teachers and administrators. It comes from removing negative influences from peers, possibly. In the study, I talk about the archetype of the bad boy image, right? And how sometimes Black boys, whether conscious of it or not, they may fall into that stereotype or try to actually emulate that stereotype of being the delinquent Black boy if it's going to earn them some sort of credibility or some sort of cachet in the social setting. But when parents talk about their need to or their desire to homeschool their sons, they talk about how actually by removing them from the system or removing those influences and barriers, it allows for authenticity to actually blossom in their boys. They can be who they want to be because they're not being watched by their peers, and there aren't these sort of behavioral expectations for them as Black boys or young Black men. And so there's also the need to save them from the system that's going to potentially label them, right? The study, the literature talks a lot about how many Black boys and Black girls are sent to special education, or some parents I've interviewed talked about how in many ways school personnel try to encourage them to actually put their child on medication so they could do better, I guess in the school setting, and how basically by removing them from that setting, they're actually able to allow their boys bodily autonomy and bodily freedom, where they could actually be energetic and run through the house or do flips and turns in the house or what have you. It may sound kind of hokey or kind of silly, but actually there isn't that gaze of scrutiny. There isn't that sort of skepticism to say, oh, well, your child has a problem settling down or learning. And so by virtue of homeschooling them, you're actually removing these negative labels and the negative gaze, the critical lens, the stereotyping. You're removing these negative interactions from their educational experiences and from their educational lives, and allowing them to be in their authentic selves and energetic selves. And also, homeschooling is a way to, for the parents of Black boys, it's a way to actually emulate Black excellence, and you could actually curate your curriculum around examples of Black male excellence, and whether it be in the education realm or in the scholarly realm or in just life. For example, whether it's someone like a W.E.B. Du Bois, or from someone like George Washington Carver, or someone who is in the arts or in politics or whatever. But any facet you can imagine, it allows parents to actually spotlight and highlight Black male excellence without any sort of curtailing or confinement by virtue of curricular mandates in the classroom or testing, or it's not, Black history isn't an offshoot. It's not a once a month thing. A 1 month, once a year thing. It's year round. For our daughters or for our girls, So while for the boys there is the building from without, for the girls actually it's a building from within. So I want to repeat that. The how gender shapes homeschooling for young Black girls is it comes from the motivation comes from an impetus to build from within. That is in much alignment with Black parenting strategies, right? Talking about ethnic racial socialization or gendered ethnic racial socialization. For girls in the homeschooling realm, there is also this drive to build from within, to build that intrinsic core so that the girls have a sense of confidence, a sense of aesthetic appreciation for their Black beauty as women and young girls, to build confidence in the classroom, especially in fields like STEM. It's a way for Black parents to teach their girls that, hey, yes, when it comes to the intersectional gauntlet of gendered racism in the future, we want to make sure that we build you up from the inside so that you have the confidence to go out there and face the world in a very fearless manner. And so while you are, in a sense, taking both kids out of the, for both sons and daughters, you are removing them or taking them out of the traditional schooling apparatus. The emphasis and the drive for the boys was more so about saving them, rescuing them by removing those barriers. For the girls, it was more so the idea of I want to pour into you, and so there's this sort of undercurrent of like there actually is the forces against Black children perhaps are a bit more aggressive or a bit more violent when it comes to the boys versus the girls. Not saying that the girls can't face these things, but it's more so an idea that for the girls, we're going to build you up from the inside to make sure that you have the confidence to face this world. And so the implications for these findings, pretty much when I talk about it more so from the academic standpoint, right? I think that these findings can certainly influence future studies in Black homeschooling motivations, right? Now we have a gender component. We can really think about, okay, the so what question, right? What does this mean? What does it matter? Well, the fact that these motivations do stem from different places for parents, for mothers and fathers, we can delve more deeply into these and sort of isolate these motivations for sons and daughters in Black homeschooling contexts. And ask ourselves, in what other ways does gender sort of provide nuance to motivations for homeschooling? When we talk about in the traditional schooling realm, if there is a push, and there are many Black families who do still continue to believe in traditional education, so this is no slight or shade to them, but for those for parents or teachers and administrators who do believe in that system still, who want to make it better, you can think about, okay, if you think about the ways in which the reasons why parents are taking their daughters out and taking their sons out, think about the reverse or the reflexivity of that impetus, right, or that motivation. In what ways can the traditional schooling apparatus, these are questions they should ask themselves, in what ways can they actually implement those motivations or sort of harness those motivations to actually build curriculum or build relationships between school staff and Black girls and Black boys in ways that are very meaningful and very powerful and they're very authentic, right? What are the ways in which teachers and administrators in the traditional schooling setting can actually engage their Black boys and Black girls in ways that are very specific to their gender identities or their racial and gender identities? How can they engage those students in ways that are meaningful, that will actually bode well for Black boys and girls in the traditional schooling system? And finally, I think the implications for this study or these findings relate to the homeschooling practice in and of itself, right? Black families, Black parents who are homeschooling, asking themselves, okay, now that we have this information about how in many ways gender does play a role in how it's motivated us to pull our kids out of the system, how can we actually use these findings or use this information, this data, to develop anti-racism strategies in our home as a homeschooling family? What ways can we actually use race and gender and how that shapes our children's identities? How can we use those to actually build stronger bonds between us as parents and children? And how can we use this information to build a longer lasting and more durable homeschooling movement in this country, which I do feel is is and has to be one of the cornerstones or pillars of a Black liberation movement. I think that Black homeschooling has to be a part of that conversation. So thank you so much for this time and for this coffee talk. I look forward to answering any questions that you all may have. And once again, this is Dr. Matthew Rankin signing off on this coffee talk. And have a wonderful, wonderful day. And thank you so much for your time.